Okay, moving on to the next team in the SEC that we will be going over today. That would be Frank Martin and his South Carolina Gamecocks. And I have a lot to say about South Carolina because I feel like they're one of the more weird programs in not only the SEC, but all of college basketball, especially when you consider really what has happened to them over the last couple of years. And it all started back in 2017 when that team consisted of Sindarius Thornwell and Dwayne Notice and Chris Silva led the Gamecocks all the way to the Final Four. And I remember after South Carolina made the Final Four, I was really able to see just how much the players really respected and loved to play for Frank Martin. And to be honest with you, I thought after that Final Four run that there was a chance that South Carolina basketball could really take off. And I said that Frank Martin really needed to take advantage of that recruiting window right after his team made the Final Four, just because you never know if South Carolina basketball is ever again going to even make the Final Four. And when you look at the South Carolina Gamecocks the last 2 years, you look at the standings and you see, oh, they finished 5th and 4th in the SEC the last 2 years. So maybe if you're a fan of the South Carolina Gamecocks, that could be room for optimism. Their total record last season by season's end was 18-13 and 10-6 overall in the SEC. So South Carolina, on paper, you look at it, they had an okay season last year. And then this year, they do bring back a decent amount of talent from that squad, including A.J. Lawson, the 6'6 junior. He averaged 13.4 points per game, 3.7 rebounds per game, 1.9 assists per game. And I do think he's going to be one of the better players in the SEC that is returning back to school for the South Carolina Gamecocks. They also bring back Jermaine Cousinard, the 6'4 redshirt sophomore, who had a really good redshirt freshman season. He averaged 12.1 points per game, 2.8 rebounds per game, 3.2 assists per game, and I do think that having Cousinard and Lawson in that backcourt is a really good thing if you are a fan of the South Carolina Gamecocks. Plus Keyshawn Bryan, who was good last year, he's going to be a senior. Plus they do return Justin Minaya, the 6'6 junior, who missed all of last season, but he's one of the better shooters in the country. And the thing about South Carolina is this. Once again, you're looking at their schedule and you see, oh, they finished in the top 5 in the SEC each of the last 2 seasons. Why isn't there more optimism, especially when you consider that basically their whole team is back? And I'll answer that question for you. Last year, South Carolina on November 19th lost a home game to Boston University. They then, later in the season, on December 30th, 2019, lost at home to Stetson. Then, the year prior, in 18-19, South Carolina goes out there and loses to an exhibition game, but albeit an actual game. They lost to Augusta, and then they lost to Stony Brook at home. They lost to Wofford, who was good, but come on, you're still South Carolina. At least put up at least a better effort against Wofford than losing at home by 20. And then they also lost to Wyoming. And South Carolina, just year after year, recently has been screwing themselves with these bye-game losses. And I feel like if that is the case in your program, that is just going to be something led by the coach that the whole program is going to have to get over. Frank Martin really has to produce a way to his players that makes everyone realize, all right, we're not trying to lose any more bye games, because ultimately the last couple years it has cost us a spot in the NCAA tournament. And the big key for South Carolina obviously is offense. I think we could all agree that Frank Martin, given his reputation as a basketball coach, South Carolina is really going to need to improve on the offensive side of the ball, because on the defensive side of the ball, they're established and they're usually pretty good on that end. And when you look at South Carolina and their offense, they do lose Malik Kotsar, who will make the offensive production a little bit more difficult, considering he was pretty good last year, and really, even though his college career was winding down, I do think he was improving and getting better and better on the offensive side of the ball. He was a steady presence in the post, and he was the only Gamecock to earn a spot on an all-SEC conference team. They also bring back 6'11 sophomore Wildens Levick and the 6'7 junior Alonzo Frank. All those guys are going to be competing for minutes as the starting center, and I do feel like Frank Martin does have some low-key nice depth that he's going to want to use for this South Carolina Gamecock squad. And it's funny because as important as Kotsar was to the USC offense last season, the post wasn't USC's primary method of scoring. Martin's teams historically like to beat their opponents down the floor and score in transition. The Gamecocks were the ninth fastest offense in the country last season, and they run off scores and steals, looking to catch opposing teams off balance and avoid setting up a half-court offense, which, let's face facts, has really not been good since Frank Martin has taken over the head coach of South Carolina. And when I look at this roster, I understand why a lot of people are going to be a little higher on them most, especially when you consider the fact that over the last couple of years, they have finished pretty high in the SEC standings. It's just the recent trajectory of this program doesn't have me convinced that's going to be the case. And I understand last year, Kentucky had some really nice wins, including that win, South Carolina had some really nice wins, including that big-time win over Kentucky at home when Jermaine Couisnard hit the game-winning buzzer beater. And Justin Minaya, I think him coming back could make a big-time impact for the South Carolina Gamecock team as well. He was injured in 1920, and he's an efficient paint scorer, but he could shoot a little bit too. He'll compete for a starting spot at the power forward position, and his freshman year, he was able to shoot 35.8% from three. He hasn't really been able to replicate that over the last couple of years. Hopefully this year he's healthy and ready to go. And then they also bring in back sophomore forward Jalen McCreary, and he had an impressive few games as a freshman, and I think he could develop into a key role player with his rebounding ability and versatility for the South Carolina team. And Frank Martin is known for his defense, and the Gamecocks should once again be one of the better defensive teams in the country. Last season, South Carolina led the SEC in adjusted defensive efficiency rate. They forced a bunch of turnovers and effectively contested outside shots. Frank Martin historically has played that 2-3 matchup zone, which is gonna be giving up a lot of three-point attempts and three-point makes when you're playing that kind of defense the whole way. But I feel like it's the right move just because, given this personnel, Frank Martin could excel because their defense, scrappy, they'll be good on the defensive side of the ball. I don't think really any South Carolina fans are ever going to worry about that. And if South Carolina is going to improve this season, they better score on the offense side of the ball. I think Minaya is another big key because South Carolina only has one player on their team that shot over 30% from three last year, and that's A.J. Lawson. They're going to need the other guys around him to improve their three-point percentage because right now that is one of the bigger improvements that I think South Carolina is going to have to make if they do want to make the NCAA tournament. And the SEC is very deep, and I do think you could even make the argument that South Carolina got better. My problem is I just don't necessarily know how much better they got, and when you compare that to all the other teams in the SEC with all these really good coaches who are getting better themselves, I do think the vibe around the South Carolina program right now is a little stale. They're going to need A.J. Lawson to somehow, some way put the team on his back and carry them to the NCAA tournament, and ultimately, I just don't see that happening, especially given the recent history. So I will take South Carolina to come in ninth in the SEC.